Yes, a very warm welcome to all of you to the Observer Research Foundation here. It seems a little bit of a traffic problem. Rain in Gurgaon, and the Prime Minister is around the corner apparently, so let's see if some more people will come throughout the morning. But I'm very happy that actually Professor Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly made it to us. Welcome to you, sir. And he has a very interesting topic, the question of borders, what borders mean for the UK and the EU. This is something we had a number of talks here, I think, on Brexit throughout the last 2 years, but this is a topic that is often neglected, especially the Ireland question there in the UK. But there are obviously many other issues regarding borders in the context of the refugee crisis as well. So I think we're very much looking forward to this presentation. And let me just say a few words about Professor Brunet-Jailly. He is a professor at the School of Public Administration at the Faculty of Human and Social Development at the University of Victoria in Canada. And he is an expert on borders, and he's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Borderland Studies. And he's also a close connection to the European Union. He was the director of the European Union Center of Excellence, the director of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at his university, and the Jean Monnet Chair as well. So I think, and then of course, yes, I'm also very happy to welcome Alex Pykett from the British High Commission, who's heading the political section there, and who's going to give some comments from a British point of view after the presentation. So Professor Brunet will speak for about half an hour, and after that we'll hear Alex's view, and then we'll open this up for discussion. So over to you, sir.
So maybe before I start, the slides are not working.
It's not working?
No, the slides are frozen to this one.
Okay.
Thank you. So before I start, what I want to say is that the way I framed the talk, and I kind of changed a little bit today, in my mind is not very controversial, because I think that when we discuss policy issues, it's really hard to get involved in the controversies. We can narrow the discussions. We can provide data so that the discussions are a bit more focused, but elected officials have to do their work, right? So it's always quite complex, especially when we're discussing something as difficult and complex as Brexit, to actually have a very clear picture. So I basically divided the talk around two main issues. One is a number of issues that have been discussed during the campaign, which are, just to set up and to illustrate the controversy a little bit. Issues of sovereignty, issues of security, which do touch on border issues, issues of migration. And I take an example which I think is the hardest or the most precise example, which is the issue of cost, to illustrate this. The EU Commission and the Parliament in the UK don't agree on the real cost. And so I just wanted to illustrate this with the range, but it just gives you an idea. And then I'll focus more on the issue of the border in Northern Ireland and the different kinds of outcome that could appear. And I discuss more broadly the border of the UK with the rest of the EU, with some recent papers that actually have been published by the UK Parliament that assess the cost of custom for the UK. So we get a sense that, we can almost feel bad for elected officials that are negotiating this, both, the people who are involved on that side in the UK and the people who are involved on the other side in the EU. Because it's a very, very complex issue. And what I think is really interesting is to see that a context actually can be maybe assessed from different facets, but that certainly when we narrow it down to looking at border options, it's actually quite difficult to re-implement borders or to maintain and transform the role of borders. So I'll elaborate a little bit on this as I go. So the first issue that I want to discuss is sovereignty and security issues. And what I do with most of these summary slides, and you'll see I have some of them across the talk, is I basically present both sides. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that there always is some form of disagreement. And it's really difficult to actually know who's right? I mean, so we look at, for instance, within the UK, what is the role of Schengen and how can we assess really seriously the impact of Schengen and in terms of security. And people are, people have arguments that go both sides. So for instance, in the case of Schengen, we know that it provides the member states a huge economy of scale. Basically, it makes the data on the big databases on movement much more unified, it makes them much more efficient, and it also allows for a much larger database because you basically pull your assets to develop pan-European database that can cover very vast networks of trade and very vast network of mobility. And so, right now the EU is working from databases that have hundreds of millions of entries, and it's working towards databases that will have probably a couple of billion of entries. And so when you're checking, for instance, the identity or the biometry of one person, you can check against way more. Now, any given state cannot do this very well. The issue is twofold. One, the sheer size and the technological challenge is very expensive. Two, and I like this citation because I do interview work on this, and then when Iceland pulled out being a candidate member, I was actually in Iceland doing field work, and I asked the head of security which is a very small country, by the way, right? It's really small. And I said, it's bizarre because your government said that they would pull out of the negotiations, but they want to remain in Schengen. And he says to me, how would you feel being a blind man in this world? So Schengen provides intelligence and security people that kind of vision. Now, it's not discussed very much, and there is, in a way, diversity here of points of view, but it's a very important issue. The other thing, which I think is really important, is that Schengen is an old partnership. It started in the 1970s between some of the members, the Trevi Group. And so it's quite important to see this, is that it's not been built over even just a generation. We're looking at a second generation of partnership between these institutions, the member states, which I think illustrate quite well this ability to, develop tools that are real economies of scale for the different member states. Now we have the sovereignty issue, and I confronted both these themes here because this is kind of the core issue in the UK. The idea of sovereignty and the defense of sovereignty has always been that basically the European Union was modifying, but certainly taking away, stripping the member states from their sovereignty. But I just wanted to illustrate the debate. There are certain people who believe that it is the case. You are basically losing the sovereignty because you are delegating power to other institutions and organizations, and you don't have direct accountability. For instance, you can't elect the people who decide on your behalf, right? And that's a very valid argument, which we know is very present, for instance, in North America today. When you look at Canada-US relations, the issue of sovereignty is at the very top of the agenda on the Canadian side. But in this case, in the EU, there are lots of states who think that they are actually growing or expanding their ability not only to control the sovereign agenda of, let's say, I'm talking about Luxembourg or Malta. They're very small units, right? Very small countries. But they can pick up very specific agendas and influence worldwide across the EU. So they basically demultiply the influence through the exercise of sovereignty within EU institutions. So the sharing actually is a factor of demultiplication of impact. And I'll give you an example. Scandinavian countries have understood this with regard to humanitarian and aid packages, for instance, by imposing language, not always money, by imposing language in international negotiations. But the language comes out of the European Commission and European decisions. Yet, if they were doing this on their own, the ability to influence the agenda would be much smaller. Think about, Sweden wanting change of language in international treaties versus having the EU member states and the Commission on their behalf say, we want that language now, right? So the two phases of the debate, the two sides here are really interesting. They also, and that's why I put them there, they also illustrate the ambit, the word ambit, the idea that it can be a widespread disagreement across the member states. And I think this is really important to realize this, is that when we talk about sovereignty, and when you look at UK versus the EU, or debate within the UK about sovereignty, you look at Tusk, for instance, and his view, he's a president, Polish, and so on and so forth, versus some of the argument presented during the campaign, it's very, very polar opposite. But actually, you do understand why it can be so extreme, yet it's about the same issue, right? Very different conceptions. So to illustrate some of the controversies, I took the issue of cost because I think I'm not so sure that people understand exactly what I'm talking about and how I'm going to go about this. But I wanted to illustrate that if we look at numbers, usually things are much more specific. And so if we're comparing budgets, we should be able to actually come quite close to being able to nail down what the disagreement should be, right? In the case of Brexit, the cost was part of the campaign. It was a big issue. Some people actually threw out numbers that were a bit ambitious, even compared to what, for instance, the UK Parliament publishes, which I'm going to show you the UK Parliament figures, and I'm going to show you the European Commission figures, and you'll see they don't measure exactly the same thing. And yet there are institutions that publish these figures and don't always agree with this. But the spread is not so vast. And this is against that spread that most of the negotiations actually are measured against. Because if you can basically cut the cost, then the UK will really save a few billion euros a year. And that is, in a way, what's at stake when we're looking at the cost issue. So this is just a representation, just to highlight this very briefly so you understand kind of how it works. Basically, the way it works is this. You pay so much every year into the UK, and because you are the United Kingdom and you had a prime minister whose name was Margaret Thatcher, she was a top negotiator for some of these things, you have a rebate, and you are the only member states who has a rebate out of all the other member states. So 1 out of 28, the UK is the member state who has a rebate on the budget. And it's never been controversial throughout the other members, but it's become an issue of solidarity for the other member states. And it has actually not helped very much in the negotiation, to be honest. People have used this against the EU, against the UK negotiator. And then there is what the EU spends in the UK, right? Because the EU has European policies, such as agricultural policy. So when we talk about Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, I'm going to give you the case study. I have the exact number for every single policy, so you'll see exactly how it works. But basically, the UK received a certain number of billion across primarily two areas: agricultural policies and subsidies, and regional development policies and subsidies. So the regional policies have grown, proportionally have become more important than the agricultural policy, but in the case of the UK, it's a little bit the same. But as a result of, this equation of paying into the EU and then receiving money back through EU programs, it is always a little bit difficult to assess for the exact numbers. You have the rebate, fine. But how much actually do you get from the EU becomes a bit more controversial, because most EU programs, especially regional policies, have to do with a co-contribution to certain programs. In other words, the member state has to pay as much as it receives, or at least a fairly expensive. So I have some of the view here. So here are the figures coming from the European Commission. And during the campaign, the number was much higher than this. I can share the slides, it's okay. I'd be happy to share the slides. But see, this number is a little controversial because it was up during the campaign for the referendum up to 18 billion. But the point is the EU says it's, and let's stay with that because you'll see that the Parliament is not that far. So 13 billion, you have the detail of the 13 billion, so it's, you know, basically some tax, trade tax, you know, the VAT, and then the contribution is 15, and then you've got the rebate, and then you've got, you know, the past contributions that are adjusted, so 27 million and 91 million. But basically, the ballpark figure that I want you to stay with is that the contribution is about 13 billion from the point of view of the EU every year. Now, this is the amount of money that the EU says goes back into the UK through EU programs, 7 billion a year. And I have the details here, and as you can see, in the case of the UK, contrary to what I just told you about regional policies, there are some significant gap here. The agricultural policy are a higher number, it's not 1/3. Generally across all the member states, it's about 1/3 agricultural, a little bit more than like 33 to 35% regional policies, and then the rest. Security, border, you know, collaborations, all the different things that they have, joint military, all these things, you know, borders, and so on and so forth. Now, if we look at the UK Parliament, you look at the numbers, you see we're not starting at 15, we're starting at 18. And when we look at the public sector receipt, which is the most important number here, we are at 4 billion, we're not at 7. Right? And these are public sector institutions, and they're very serious one. There is no reason to doubt that their numbers are like, you know, made up. It's just that they have different ways of reporting. Right? They have different ways, they have different traditions of reporting. They don't actually measure exactly the same things. Now, this, in my mind, is the most important part in the debate because it sets the stage for the negotiation over whether, over the kind of agreements that the UK will end up negotiating. So then the next question is, if you pull out of the EU and you still want to have access to the market, which is a big deal to have access to the EU market, especially when you look at the size of the EU market and the size of your presence in this EU market today, can you actually save more money? Can you actually, you know, basically save, in the case of the UK, have savings that are well under 9 billion? So if you can bring that number, the 8.9, to let's say 1 or 0, you're a winner, right? And what we see is that spread. I put it here, right? The real cost is between 7 or 6 billion, and the debate cost is between 5 and 9. And I put it this way because I want to highlight that depending on what we're discussing, there is a bottom number, 5 billion. Even if we disagree on everything, the bottom line is that if the UK cannot actually save more than 5 billion a year, why would they get out of the EU? I mean, you guys can do this with your own pocketbook. You just think, I want to share, I want to share real estate, I want to do whatever partnership. And I'm highlighting this because I think it's really important to understand that everything that is done in the EU is driven by this. So my message, even though I study borders and border migration and all these different policies, is to tell you that there is a very utilitarian rationale behind being a member of the European Union. If you can't fulfill that mandate, there is no reason for being part of it. The EU Commission is always on the defensive to actually make sure that this economy of scale is really clear for all the member states. And it's been a winner for 2 generations because it has grown its business and its policy responsibilities because it can demonstrate this. Obviously, the British elite contests it, right? It's pretty clear that there are lots of people in the UK who disagree with this. And so, see, this is interesting because when we look at stats that have been done by economists and projections, we also see a cost. And the 2 different models that are used here is the free trade agreement scenario, which is in light red, versus the World Trade Organization scenario. You see that there is a bit of a gap here, and that so therefore the UK economy would actually maybe not make it, would not actually save so much money. I think, frankly, that we won't know until after. We can have some forecasting, but I think it's a really difficult thing to evaluate seriously. So I'm just going to give you a bit more of a background to show you this, because we're talking about the tug of war now in defining all of the policies. The context here is really important to understand what happens in the borders, how much the EU is going to want to be lenient and help, basically. And borders are falling, right? Regulatory borders and hard borders, the territorial boundaries, at one point are going to be enforced. The regulatory borders are the ones that have to do with the rule of law. They are the least visible. They will create the most damage to either side. And the hard borders can have a huge psychological impact on people. So this, in my mind, that table helps us understand some of this. The UK economy trades a lot with a number of states, but in each case almost is a small part of the economy of the different states. But collectively, it's more than half the world trade of the UK. So how do you feel when you have to deal with this? And your number one customer, right, is on the other side of the channel and is divided, let's say, in 28, in this case, it's a little less. But for each one of them, you're a small part of their own income. You are not in a very strong position. Now, I think that during the referendum, during the campaign, and even during the first few months, there was very little data on these things. People were not well aware of this relationship. And I think that the EU, frankly, has abused this. They've pushed extremely hard on something as simple as this. It's like you cannot really blackmail the auto industry in Germany. You cannot really blackmail the pharmaceutical in France. You cannot really, because you're a small part. We're willing to take the risk. One thing that is really interesting is that we realize that for the UK, beyond all of the other issues I've discussed, it's an issue of regulations. This, however, is where I think that the EU has really the upper hand, because it's a huge regulator. I just showed you that the numbers, I think it's pretty obvious to everybody, right? When you look at number of billions, what is 5 billion today for an economy like the UK? It's peanuts. It's not a huge number. Certainly for the EU, it's not a huge number at all. The EU budget on its own is 115 billion a year. 5 billion, okay, it's going to bite a little bit, right? But it's really not much. But this is a big issue because once the regulation reframe the relationship, open or closed markets, these are the real boundaries that fall. These are the boundaries nobody thinks about. They're the regulatory power of the EU, and we know that the regulatory power of the EU today for a new member state, any new member state, is about 1 cubic meter of legislation. It basically, in the case of Poland, which is the case I use in a lot of my talks, it basically meant to rewrite the entire legislative package of Poland, not entirely, 60% of it. So you basically turn your legislative system into a half EU system, and you rewrite what you had before into it. Otherwise, you are not part of the EU Union. You're not part of the Union. And today in the negotiation, this is where it's really hard. This is where we actually don't discuss this very much. We hear about a lot of other issues, but this is actually really the core of these new boundaries that are being implemented. The regulatory systems are being discussed chapter by chapter, and every time it's, well, you opt out or you stay in, and then we look at the impact. 56 chapters, thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages of legislation. So, just very briefly, to also size out this, when you look at the impact on the EU budget, it's really small, right? It's about 7 billion on the EU budget, and it goes, I have the impact on all the different policies of the EU. I just want to illustrate again the power relationship between the two in the negotiations here. And I think that the EU is very quickly aware of this. And that this is a table which I summarize afterwards. We will show you something that nobody thought about, is that the EU uses its budget in proportions. That means that when the UK pulls out and the money that has been given to the UK for a number of years is actually not given to the UK anymore, the proportions stay. And that means certain smaller states are now benefiting from the fact that the UK is pulled out, especially natural allies of the UK, because they trade a lot with them, like Denmark and the Netherlands. You'll see I have them here. Greece, Bulgaria, Latvia, and the Netherlands. Denmark, sorry, I made a mistake here. Now, talking a little bit, and I'll go in greater detail when I talk about the Northern Ireland and Ireland. But talking about some of the scenarios, what we can see here is that, you know, if the UK were to decide to go with the type of agreements that relate Norway to the rest of the EU, it would still have to contribute 3.5 billion a year, which is what Norway pays into the EU to be an associated country, right? Basically, it's part of the European Economic Area, and therefore it doesn't have a seat at the decision table, but it has to contribute some funding every year. And it's the same for Iceland, it's the same for Switzerland, and some of the associated countries, some of the countries who have some economic relations with the EU. And we see that 3.5 billion is only 1.5 billion away from the lowest figure. So it's a marginal win. I think all these elements put the UK in a difficult situation. Now, when we look at border and migration, I'm going to be a little bit more critical here. It was a major win in the campaign, this issue of migration. It's directly related to borders. It really impacts this, and it's a completely fabricated story. Because when you look at the data on migration and the role both of the two regulatory packages that we have. So now I'm talking about regulations that have to do with bordering Europe. The Schengen regulation allows for member states to have no borders. And they share economies of scale like database, custom practices, and they have created all kinds of economies of scales. For instance, you clear customs in many different harbors, in many different airports, but you clear customs for all of the member states, all of the Schengen states, which means that the UK, and I'll talk much more about this at the end, the UK clears customs for all maritime goods in Antwerp. Okay? Very important to realize this. The regulatory package of Schengen has created these economies of scales where you were basically able, it's not just saying my custom officers or my border guards are now working with other Europeans. It's that you may not need them, so you actually do not have the staffing, you don't have the costs anymore, right? And Schengens have cleared all the borders and created these economies of scales that are quite fabulous. And then the other regulation is Dublin. Dublin organizes basically the hard border that everybody talks about. You step into the EU, you cross actually not the Schengen border because we talk about the Schengen visa, right? But you cross into the Dublin and Schengen regulations at once, basically. You enter a shared space, which is regulated by Schengen, but who is responsible? It's the border state. So it could be Romania, it could be Italy, France, Spain, or Portugal, right? But that means that when the UK were during the campaign for the referendum, one of the issues was actually the migration issue, and there was a huge misunderstanding as to what kind of migrants are we talking about. Because most of the media used a reference to Syrians coming in, but they never reached the UK. And we have the data to prove this. And the UK is a good player, by the way, when we look at how many asylum seekers they welcome every year. So it's not the same population and it's not the same numbers. So when we look at, for instance, the reality check on asylum seekers, we realize that the UK is actually a pretty good player. I have the two different dates. UK 7,300, and then we have the UK right there also. So we see that the UK actually plays its role and it has a policy of welcoming people. But certainly it's not an invasion coming from all sides of Europe because they actually cannot reach the UK, right? They do not reach the UK. The points of entry used to be in Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And they moved in 2013, 14, 15 on the eastern side of Europe. And so what we see is a complete transformation here of the system. And then when we look at who within the Schengen zone goes to the UK, we realize that there is a large population of students. So that's the debate that we had. Neil Farage and Boris Johnson had a certain view of what was at stake, and the stay had a different view of what was at stake. And I just want to point to you these two numbers, which I think are maybe controversial, possibly interesting. Is the number of professors who come from the EU who actually work in the UK, and the number of graduate students who come from the EU who work in the UK. So I'm going to pass on these ones because I'm going to discuss the Republic of Ireland question. So to illustrate some of the general ideas that I've just discussed, I thought that looking at the relationship between Ireland and Northern Ireland would be very interesting. I have had students go there and work in Belfast with colleagues and a small team at the Border Studies Institute at Queen's Belfast for since 2014. And so we have papers that have come out of this, and then my colleague, Katie Award, is very active because she's very involved in both border security and border programs, and she has organized workshops. And I have done field work with her, not last fall, but the fall before. We had a workshop with policymakers, and so I can really understand some of the issue quite well. But we have collected lots of data through the research program that I have on borders in globalization. And some of the things that frame the debate are on this slide here, one of which has to do with the contribution of the EU to agriculture in Northern Ireland. And as you can see, it's a highly subsidized agricultural economy which flows through the Republic of Ireland into the UK. It's kind of interesting. But it shows a great dependency on EU funding. Which makes the issue really complex, right? It's like you realize that these trade networks, you realize that all of these interactions are both established by the old relations, historical relations, but also have been transformed by the presence of the EU. And when we look at the EU programs, and I think this is really interesting in the political context that a lot of people are discussing, right? Is that the role of the EU has really contributed the cash that has helped with the peace programs. And I'm going to focus on Interreg VA 240. So one of the things, for instance, that has been operational on the boundary line very effectively now for almost 2.5 years is a regional hospital. So you have to picture this. What is a regional hospital? Cross-border regional hospital. You have a few cross-border regional hospitals in Europe. It's the ability for a state to basically get more funding for a hospital in a border region because the other side doesn't have a hospital. And how do you organize a regional hospital? You don't really create a second hospital. You want to accumulate more resources in the hospital that you have, but you want to expand the ability that hospital has to serve people across a large region that straddles the boundary line. So in this case, it was really, and I talked to the director of the regional hospital, that's why I'm taking this as an example. So you have one in Catalonia, between Catalonia and France. You also have a regional hospital between Belgium and Wallonia and northern France as well. And both are really, in a way, were really experimental. And then the one in Northern Ireland came a little later as a way to bridge two sides, but also to bring together counties and the population of counties that had been almost at war for a number of generations before. So you see the symbol that is behind that regional hospital was very strong. And how do you do this concretely? Well, all you really need to do is to develop process to make sure that the different general practices, medical practices in the region assess hospital needs the same way. So there is a collaboration as to how you do the diagnostics, and you have to agree, and you have to work with the specialists within the hospital to develop this process. But the real link is only ambulances. So the real cost is to create a system of ambulances that can be able to cross the border without stopping at full speed. So 2 years ago on the border, people stopped dying. Right? They had their last death, a cardiac arrest, 2 years ago. Ever since, it's never happened anymore. Why? Because the ambulances just go straight across. And they reach the hospital in time. And it's like insurance policy, it's like fire trucks. They have a certain time that they have to go from wherever they pick the people to reach the hospital, and it's all measured in seconds. So the ambulances are really the key. Well, the fear of the people, an Interreg program VA basically developed and helped fund the creation of that regional hospital. And this became a problem because after Brexit, what the director of that health region was arguing is that he was starting to have difficulty hiring staff because people assumed that it would disappear. So in the best situation, that new infrastructure, which is an health infrastructure but has a peace mandate, if you want, might disappear. Even when people having a debate and say, we'll check people at the border, they don't realize what they're saying with regard to this regional hospital and the impact it can have on rural communities and their local elected officials who say, we've just started shaking hands with the other side, and do you think I'm going to go on? He supports so-and-so right? So if they see the border checker reappear, they lose this infrastructure, they lose this access to health that they've had for a number of years. So this is one of the things that can happen when we're discussing the Northern Irish case. So some of the models that I'm presenting here, the European Union case with the pro and the cons, and the European Economic Area and the European Free Trade Area, or we're going to pass on this, but I have a number of scenarios here that have been studied with regard to the relationship between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, are quite interesting because in most cases, we realize that it's difficult, actually. The reimposition of the border will not be done easily. The only way that you can actually maintain, the so-called ideal relation, which would be, people have talked up front as, a technological border that would be virtual and that nobody would feel. And the more you discuss it, and especially border specialists like us who study issues of security, we know that it will hurt because you cannot have a free-flowing border. At some point, you're going to have some checks. I'm going to illustrate this in a minute. But all these different scenarios, whether if we eliminate the European Union, if we take the European Economic Area, I've already discussed it a little bit because it's the typical relationship that Norway has with the rest of Europe. And it has a cost that is still 3.5 billion. So if we look at that option, we also know that in that option, the real win is not so great. You're going to spend more in the negotiations and so on and so forth. There is no clear win on this. And it gets worse if you look at the European Free Trade Area, or if you go all the way to the World Trade Organization, for instance, there is a cost to it that is higher, actually, in it. But it would be a bit of a maybe of a win to actually have a no agreement and go back to, World Trade Organization standards, basically. Now, the big issue is this issue of custom union. I want to illustrate this. So I'm going to go into it. I'm going to pass on these. So if we have the best ideal scenario of a new border, the new reinvented border between Northern Ireland, part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, and if we don't want a hard border, down the territory, but also the Irish Sea, then there is a problem with the regulatory package, which I told you, nobody discusses them, but they are the most lethal of all, because they imply some check. So the issue here would be a form of a custom border, which can be almost invisible. Sweden and Norway have such a border. So I don't know if in the room there are people who have ever crossed the border between Sweden and Norway, but just to tell you, there are basically certain roads and certain port of entry that specialize into dealing with the issue of custom. And the idea is just to basically be able to concretely decide that, most of the region will not have them, but you will have a few port of entry which will basically specialize in receiving all the trucks with these different kinds of goods. And this is where basically you just register them. And most of the time today, everything is done before the trucks arrive at the border. All the paperwork is there. It's just on very rapid check that the papers are totally in line with what's in the database. So it can even be a border where trucks will stay maybe 45 to 90 seconds, right? There are some cases of inspection when there is discrepancies. But the point that I'm trying to make is that you can specialize the roads, and some of the port of entries will have no check. They may have some check for traffickings, but it should not be, but still there will be some checks. And then if you miss on that option, you have option 2. And there you can basically decide that you develop a new protocol. But what I want to say about this is that even in a case where you develop a new protocol, the checks are going to be much more felt by the local population. More of the points of entry are going to be basically redeveloping the kind of infrastructures they need to verify that the people that go across the boundary line actually can be registered, have been registered, have the right papers, and so on and so forth. In the case of Northern Ireland, the whole issue of trade, could be dealt with by the local authorities there. So the Northern Ireland executive could basically have the authority to do this, but it's not what we've seen in the negotiations, right? And then there is the issue of dependency, which I highlighted in the number. For instance, if as I said, all of the trade that comes from Northern Ireland actually today goes through the Republic of Ireland into the UK. So this makes the issue a bit more complicated than is assumed. So final thoughts. Very recently, the Parliament in the United Kingdom published a number of reports, one of which has to do with customs. And so I come back to this because I think it's an important one. And I actually have students, as soon as I found out about this, I've asked students to check the data and make sure that we could maybe even expand the analysis to go beyond. So I'm coming back to the idea that the UK is actually clearing custom for all maritime goods in Antwerp. What does this mean for the UK? What does this mean for the EU? Well, for the UK, it has a cost. One of the costs is that they have no staffing today to do it, because over the last almost 35 years, they've cleared custom on the continent. So there is a staff need of 3,000 to 5,000 custom officers that should be trained. And then there is a cost to actually creating the infrastructure. And the evaluations go between 19 and 26 billion, which seems a huge number. But if something like this comes in play in the negotiation, it basically derails everything. Because, as I said, the win situation is being able to win 5 billion per year. Otherwise, why leave the EU? But if you have a bill like this, 26 billion, it's going to take you 5 years. And then it's only custom. What about everything else, right? So it's a case study that highlights this. And I think it illustrates quite well the difficulty of those negotiations, but also why it is that both the UK and the EU seem sometimes to be speaking but not facing each other, like they speak parallel to each other, and the kind of proposals are being dismissed on both sides, which I think is, frankly very sad, but it's the situation that we're faced with. So there are ideological differences, but I would bring them down to something very concrete, which is what I highlighted in the talk. Regulatory regimes from the continent and in the UK are understood as very different. The UK doesn't like regulatory systems. The EU is a regulatory machine. It transforms the states. It makes them European. And the UK wants to control this because they have a sense of loss of sovereignty. So we don't debate them very much, but the data is really there. The regulatory machine of the EU is very, very influential. Certainly, it's not going to be the end of the UK or of the EU, as it was actually argued in the media in North America quite a bit, that the UK pulled out and it's the end of the EU. But certainly there are very serious border issues, and not migration issues, contrary to what we have learned, but trade issues, very concrete things that have to do with custom and how you clear custom and how you deal with this very pragmatically. And I think of all the partners of the UK, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are probably at the forefront of the difficulties, right? They illustrate best that difficulty. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I think that was really very interesting because we all have been following up on what's being reported in the media about Brexit, but there is very little deep research into it. So I think it's a very important effort that you've made here in researching these issues and giving all these figures. So Alex, if we sum this up, then it seems that on the economic front, saving 5 billion or not saving doesn't really seem to be worth all the effort if at the same time you are keeping out the people that you actually want to have, while you're probably not really stopping the influx or of unwanted migrants, or there might be not that many after all. And then on the Ireland question, it seems to be extremely complicated, and you would really have to renegotiate the whole process that has been in place over the last generations. So what do you make out of all of this now?
Thank you, and thank you very much, Emmanuel and Britta as well. To explain, in a sense, why I'm here, I mean, this is really about your fascinating research, but we, as the UK, are in a very, very interesting and frankly complicated process, which is Brexit, and nobody's done this before. So we are having to learn, the European Union is having to learn. That is obviously on the basis of a democratic decision that was reached by people. So we are reflecting that democratic decision. But it is incredibly complex. I mean, I think I would start where you finished in terms of the sheer complexity of it, and also, frankly, the value of some of the research work which can now be done, and the data and so forth, which will be, I expect, then considered by the people, the officials who are going through this process. That process is continuing apace. In fact, it is only a matter of weeks or perhaps a couple of months before we expect and hope for an agreement between the UK and the European Union on the terms of our deal in leaving. But as you've just had a fascinating kind of example of just the complexity of the issues that we are going to be working on to get that agreement. But that is our ambition. We are very ambitious for a good agreement with the European Union. I'll touch on that again in a moment, which, and where you finished in terms of some of your points, not the end of the EU, we're very clear. We don't want that either. We want to see a united and strong Europe, but we as a member state have made our decision to leave. And there's a bigger debate, and I suggest we don't go all over the term why we voted that way, because we could be here for all day. But I will make a few remarks on some of the specific things that you mentioned, in no particular order. But on immigration and the place that did have in the debate, I agree that was an important part of the debate leading up to the referendum. I mean, I'd make a distinction, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions as I reflect on this as well. I mean, I think there is a distinction between immigration and asylum. Exactly. And I think that you're right, that some issues, Syria and so forth, did become part of that debate. They're controversially part of that debate in the sense of the way they were portrayed. Actually, as someone who was there in London at the time during the whole lead up to the vote, there was also a great deal of focus on our colleagues and friends from within the European Union who were living in the UK. That was, so I wouldn't see it as people from outside or people from inside, but certainly those within the European Union, and the decision that was taken some years ago in terms of the accession countries to join was one of the issues that came up a lot. And actually, and I say this personal remark, but genuinely, I mean, I have the most liberal-minded friends who have remarked occasionally on the sheer increase in population in the UK and the strain that has put on school places, hospitals, and so forth. Now, other part of that debate, very important, our health service, our schools, and so forth, also rely on people who are coming to work in the UK. But I would make that.
Have a figure on that, the increase in population over the last, like,
Well,
I don't
it
know,
was,
2 years?
so we are now over 60 million and we were 57 million about 10 or so years ago. So, you know, I mean, that's a substantial increase, I think.
Yeah, the issue is not. Do you want us to debate this a bit?
We can do, or I can make a few more remarks.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll make
Sorry,
a few,
I-
just, but anyway, so that's
I'm
an,
more comfortable if you do.
fine. On the costs, I mean, yes, again, it became an issue during the referendum, fiercely debated, it cost this much, it cost that much. I think actually something you showed in your figures, because of other reasons, namely whether it's currency fluctuation or whether it's certain receipts, there is not one figure. It is very hard to get. You can make a forecast, you can make your best estimate, but it is very hard to actually give a precise figure. We know in the environs of what we're talking about. I was fascinated by your point about, you know, well, if you can't sort of make the savings of 5 billion, then why are you leaving? Well, we're leaving because we voted to leave. The point is that there was a decision was taken, and now we have to, and we will, make the best possible job out of leaving. And as I say, we are ambitious for a trade partnership with the European Union, just as we are ambitious for other agreements we can reach around the world too. You did focus quite a bit on the sort of the rational choice argument, as you might put it, into why people make decisions or countries make decisions. I mean, I'd just say on that as well, I mean, even if the proportion of UK trade, which is for the Netherlands or something, I mean, quite large in that case, yes, we are just one of many, of course we are. But then by the same rational choice, then obviously it is also in the interests of those countries to keep a deal. Why would you? Why would you not want a good deal which can actually preserve and get the same kind of outcomes that we want to see? Yes, I think there is another then political question about the European Union and not wanting to be seen in any way to risk its future, of course. There is that as well, but that's where it becomes complicated. But if you were to take it to a very rational, simple choice, then, well, have a good trade deal would be actually in everybody's interests. On Ireland, I'll finish on this. I mean, I think this is something which is absolutely essential to the way that we are going around the negotiations. We are committed, and indeed committed alongside the European Union in an agreement we reached in December last year, that we do not want to see any reversal of the progress that has been made for peace in Northern Ireland, a commitment to the Good Friday Agreement, which is the basis of that, including the government of the Republic of Ireland. And as a result, we are now looking for an arrangement which we can reach to solve what are, as you illustrated, very complicated practical issues, but they are based on some very core principles. We are also clear that we cannot have a hard border in the Irish Sea, which makes a distinction between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, just as we are clear we cannot have a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And those negotiations are taking place at the moment. They will continue, I think, intensively and will be subject to all sorts of ideas, inputs, and I think that's welcome. Indeed, one of the things that we have said is that actually we are pleased to work with the European Union on something which will be creative in terms of a solution to this issue, because we have to be, because we haven't been here before. That is going to require some serious work, some goodwill on both sides, but I think that we, whether it's the European Union or obviously the government of Ireland as the key stakeholder in this, are very determined to do that. So in that sense, I close by just saying, you know, thank you again. I thought it was really interesting, the work that you are doing and providing that kind of analysis and those kind of ideas which contribute to this debate. So thank you.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, so I suggest that you probably comment on it and then we'll open it to the floor.
Okay.
Yes? Okay.
So, yeah, so I focused on the migration in the debate, the issue of migration and then the increase of population. There is no doubt that you have more migrants from outside the UK in the UK. There is no doubt, however, as well, that these are members of the Schengen countries. It has put strain on generally the services provided by the government. Everybody knows this, and there is no issue about this. Schools, health services. But this is also because, and this is not part of EU budgets. It's not the responsibility of the EU to provide health services or education in the UK. It's the responsibility of the UK governments, central government and local governments. And their budgets have been stable. So you have an increase of population because the economy of the UK is thriving. Otherwise, people wouldn't go to London. I have so many friends who work in London. And all are doing really well. Financial traders and architects and lawyers and, it's quite amazing because it's the world capital, right? We know this. But again, certain of those services that should provide for a greater population have not had the ability to increase. So I think that's kind of confusing debates in a way. That's the kind of thing that I thought during the campaign was not so. So the cost of the services is not something that we can attribute to the EU, and the diversity of the migration is because of Schengen for sure, but it doesn't have to do with people from outside the EU Schengen. So, and I think it's hard, it was controversial, but I don't think it's super controversial. On the Irish Northern Ireland border, most border specialists that I know today that read and follow what's going on are very pessimistic. But maybe we need to do actually more research on this. Your comments are very helpful because I'm thinking, sometimes we want to give up because we read the media and we hear I didn't want to cite or point at anybody, but some of the statements that came out in the media just this past week about the Irish border, the idea that people would be checked, it scares everybody. Because if you check people, you kill the hospital, for instance, right? And the symbol of this institution is actually a symbol of peace, because you can have doctors from the other side who save lives. It's so powerful, right? So I agree. I think we should do more research, and I think we can do more, but providing for a custom border that works well, for instance, which I think is the absolute minimum that will ever happen. So you will have some specialized roads and some custom borders so that the local population doesn't, and you could even specialize the roads for hospitals, for instance, access. That's totally feasible. It will make some roads and some access longer, but I think that, it means that we're going to work on these things a lot more now. But there will be some form of a border, and people will feel it.
I think just briefly, I think our position is very much there should be no physical infrastructure on that border. Now, as I say, the creative solutions to that, frankly, we don't have them yet, or at least I don't have them. I think that people have spoken about technology, but there is I value your opinion on this. There is a view that technology is not there yet. In other words, there is not that technological solution yet. But if you...
So if we were to say that we have a Schengen border that is undisturbed within the island, and the Irish Sea, right? But that's just for Schengen, that's just for people. And we wanted to have just custom borders, but they would not have to be at the boundary line. We can do it technologically today. We call these hubs of connectivity. They are basically transportation platforms where people clear, actually. And they can be located anywhere on the island. It's just that all the flow of trade goes into this and then can go wherever. But you will have to have them. And it's interesting because, for maritime trade, for instance, the UK actually do clear custom in Antwerp, and it could be a deal that, you know, we will clear custom in Antwerp. We will have our own officers. We will have our own, you know, investments. And for the Republic of Ireland, we'll have also clearing homes, basically clearing houses in the south and in the north. And that way there is no infrastructure at the border. But that assumes that the people still enter the people, and that's very different, right? Because for goods now, we have all the technology we use. We can even clear custom in production chains. You can even create, for instance, I mean, this is one of my favorite examples. I love giving it, but in Canada, we have farms that raise cattle according to the standards that are only available and according to specific standards that are only serving 3 countries in the world: Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And if you try to sell those cattle anywhere else in the world, you can't. It's illegal because the regulatory standards are very different. So these farms cannot, and they're farms and packaging, right? So in other words, one of the questions that I very often ask is that, okay, so these farms are they in Japan already? Because the goods and the people are basically trained so that they make the frozen steaks that leave them according to Japanese standards. And I think it's really funny because, you know, this is cattle country. People love their steaks. Well, these guys can't traffic because nobody's ever going to want to have a Japanese steak in Alberta or in Manitoba or across Saskatchewan. These are Japanese steaks. And it's illegal anyway. So you can have mechanisms like this that apply not just for, you know, in the food industry, in the processing of the food industry, where you align standards and regulatory systems, right? But you can actually create areas that you can have like points of entry, you can have harbors, you can have logistic points of transportation, logistic areas where all of this converges, and then you clear custom there and go, or you can even push it back into the production chain, and it does work. And a lot of modern custom agencies like the Canadian Custom, they're actually working at doing this more and more. They basically work with their very large customers, the largest firms, and they say, we're going to implement all these regulatory systems into your production chain. So you know what? Huge economies of scale for you, and then for us it's the same. And what is it? It's a software that we look and, you know, you just put the input of the goods that are going in different directions and you know exactly what you have to pay. And then you're done with it. So it's very, very effective. And the thing is, you need people with all the skills, you need the computers, you need, you know, and that requires certain level of sophistication. But large companies now can definitely do this. The issue in many countries is the small and medium-sized businesses that don't even have, let's say, a computer networks inside, but work with, you know, 3 or 4. Anyway, so in many parts of the world, you know, people who are subcontractors don't have basically the technological level to actually reach these standards. But I know that the World Customs Organization, for instance, is developing these programs and training people around the world. But we can do it for good. It's a bit more difficult for people. That's the issue.
No, I can see that. We are actually not working in a complete vacuum here. This last point I'll make on Ireland, unless somebody's got any questions. But I mean, there is actually a common travel area agreement, and that includes the Isle of Man, the Channel Islands, and so forth.
Yeah.
So that the ability of people within the UK, from the UK to the Republic of Ireland, has been there. Was then brought into the EU, I think, in the Amsterdam Treaty. Yeah. So there is something to work with. Again, there are bilateral agreements on health and so on and so forth. So in that sense, we're not working in a complete vacuum. I think that the task will be to turn that into a package which is obviously acceptable to all and doesn't cut across anyone's red lines. But there are agreements already there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I think the next time you come to Delhi, I would like to invite you to speak on the economy of borders. It's really fascinating, I think.
You can invite me and Dan and Jay. It would be a great team. And maybe some other of his colleagues.
That would be really interesting indeed. Please, if you have questions and comments, please introduce yourself. And those in the back, if you could come to the front, there are mics here, and you just press that red button. If there are not that many questions, I can take them one by one. Otherwise, I would collect them. Anybody else? No?
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for this wonderful and vivid presentation, and thank you, Mr. Alex, also for your kind insights, giving the insights and all. I'd like to ask you just specifically two questions. One is about, you mentioned about the businesses, and you also talked about the businesses inside the UK. But just following the Brexit, what happened, mostly the economic medias, they are taking up the stories on churning out the stories basically on the companies like the big Bs, like, for example, Goldman Sachs, then Microsoft, even from Barclays, they are shifting their headquarters. Deutsche Bank is not headquartered in London, but they have a good, big operational office in London. So they are shifting their offices from there. And along with that, when I say about this offices, this not alone the executives and the employees, they're also talking about this logistical impact, and then this supply chain marketing, all this. So when you talk about all this, it hugely impact the employment of England. So how do you consider it? And my second question is that Britain has a rich legacy of creating trends in every time when you talk about politically, economically, for every reason. So following up EU, there are a couple of organizations. There are slightly following the EU type. For example, OAU, which has now become Addis Ababa headquarter, African Union, and then to some extent SARC. Or if you take, for example, ASEAN, there is a plural entity. So when Britain exists, will it hamper the organizational psyche and the organizational mechanism of this regional institute? Thank you.
I can make a few points. On two questions, thank you very much. So on business, I don't think some of these organisations have moved. I think some of them are making contingency plans. Those often grab the headlines, but actually I can understand why businesses are always looking at risk and contingency. That's what they do. They haven't moved. And I think there is a distinction there. And I think you will see perhaps some employees have moved, yes. But in terms of the actual number of institutions which have moved, gone now, it is very small. I can't think of any off the top of my head which have actually made that physical move. They will make some contingencies. I mean, the voice of business has been heard very clearly, both before the referendum. Well, when I say business, I need to be careful here. Not all businesses think the same, but nevertheless, the largest organisations representing business have made strong statements ahead of the vote and are continuing to make them now. The ones they're making now are that they want to see as frictionless trade as possible with the European Union, and then can be looking externally as well, because we will not be tied down by the same rules. All of this is for negotiation, but nevertheless, that is their voice. We agree. So we want the same thing. So with that kind of outcome in mind, I don't think that I would overstate at this moment in time what has actually happened or happening. It is just one of the scenarios that we will see play out in the next few years. On the second point, about the organisational psyche, I don't think we, as a government, would have a kind of view on that as a broad principle. I said earlier on that just because we are leaving the European Union in no way makes a statement we are not making any statement about the future of the European Union other than we want to continue it, be strong and continue, in accordance with the wishes of its member states. Would it have a broader effect? I don't think so. I mean, the UK, certainly at one time, in fact, India might be one of the countries which is rivaling it now, but the UK at one time was a member of more multilateral organisations than any other. And we are still. We will leave the European Union, but we will still be a member of many, many other multilateral organisations. SARC, I have to say, I think SARC at the moment is in a period which is, because of the internal politics of SARC, not anything that is going on, in my view, around the world. I think that is more about the relationship between the particular countries who are members, not reflecting some kind of wider zeitgeist.
So I agree. I think, there are lots of businesses, financial institutions that have bought, let's say, building elsewhere, and they have maybe plans. It's because there is uncertainty as to the chapters that regulate their area of business. And they want to make sure that they are prepared in case they have to move, because the costs are going to increase. So if the cost increases because the deals are not what they want, and they're very utilitarian in the way they look at this, right? If they can make some savings, they're not going to move. If they're losing money. And so what we may see is that certain sectors are going to be winners and others are going to be losers. And so you'll have marginal adjustment in the end, because not all sectors are going to be dealt with the same, I guess, tug of war, right? At the end of the negotiations, some things are going to go and others will be, in a way, more successful. And I think it's important to be aware of this. There will be an adjustment, which may have an unintended consequence that may have a cost to both the EU and or the UK. And that's disrupting. Businesses don't like this. It makes a lot of sense that they would be preparing for the future. So yes, some cities, like even Paris, for instance, but also Amsterdam, Lisbon, for instance, and Frankfurt, have advertised and have been in the media and so on and so on. I don't know if it will have a huge impact, but certainly certain industries are already thinking about being able to move and adjust. And I think it makes sense. It's also possible that we see a transformation of these regulatory borders that I'm talking about, right? It's possible that there is creativity in this area, and that both the UK and the EU kind of decide that they can work through these, I guess, the logistic platform, so that, so basically, UK, and so that there are economies of scale on both sides. The leading factor, in my mind, and the decisive factor is that you have to understand that member states in the EU want to make economies of scale. It's not just political. It was an ideological project, right? It was a peace project when it started. But ever since the single market, ever since, like, for the last 30 years, I would say, the driven rationale is that it is a way for states to save money and to make their economies more efficient. When you read the documents, for instance, of the regional policies, and you look at, the commissioners in charge for the last, let's say, 15 years, they talk about modernizing local government institutions, making them more efficient, so they are economic development houses, basically, right? So it's a way to make Europe more aggressive competitively. So I think a lot of people tend to not focus enough on this very utilitarian, almost functional thinking that people have. But if you do interview work in Brussels and you talk even to people who are in charge of border security, one of my contacts, for instance, is second to the Home DG Home, which basically they deals with all the borders and stuff. He always comes back to this. He says to me, the rationale is, obviously there are political implications, but it's, are we saving money? Are we saving political issues? Like, are we basically being able to navigate without problems? So even what we see, let's say, in some of the eastern side countries today, most elected officials don't want these issues. Some of them exploit them, but most of them would rather be re-elected. That's the rationale. So if the EU can come up with a policy idea that allows them to be re-elected, they're happy to move forward. Bulgaria, all these countries that have had, major issues with migration, Greece. And we have to remember this. It's kind of a political cost or a budgetary cost. But if you can actually find a way to limit this, then the EU is successful, and the member state and all the officials involved are successful. So it's a lot of piecemeal politics, it's a lot of debate, a lot of tug of war, and that was what is come in the media. You see all the murk, you see all the, the media love this because it sells papers. But the reality behind is that these people know exactly what they're negotiating. So the uncertainty in what we're discussing, I think, is really important. The businesses don't like this. And it doesn't serve the government in the UK or in the EU well to have this uncertainty today. Everybody wants it to disappear at some point. I don't think it's going to start a trend for the reasons that I'm telling you. I think that the result of Brexit is that it's going to make the European Commission, and not just it, it's going to make EU-level institutions, possibly even the Parliament, the Council, more powerful, more influential, and more determining in terms of the policy outcome. Because member states find through them solutions that they can't find on their own. See, this is one of the things that people don't understand well about EU officials and that kind of negotiating. You're in because you're in the partnership, because you have institutions there at your service that want you to win. So you're prime minister of, a small country, Malta, Lithuania, whatever. They want you to win at some point. Otherwise, the EU institutions wouldn't exist. So it's gone way beyond the peace agenda that it had, for instance, 1950s. And it's gone way beyond think about this retrospectively. The first three communities had to do with energy. Coal, steel, right? It was industry and energy and Euratom. And what is the EU doing now? It's federating all of this so that there are huge economies of scale across all the member states. Sharing buying, sharing infrastructures, reorganizing all the networks, so electricity price is going to go down, so that oil reliance is going down, so all the energy, all of the basic industrial infrastructures are cheaper. That is why Juncker basically became the head of the European Commission in 2015. That was his number one agenda. It was super clear. So I think when we look at the context, the political context, we end up having a stronger European Commission. That's the political context, I think.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Dhananjay Tripathi. I'm from South Asian University, from Department of International Relations. I have two questions. Alex, I have a question for you because the Brexit debate in India also, we followed it very carefully. And why? Because we have a very historical relationship with the United Kingdom. And in one of the slides, Emmanuel has presented like 37,000 professors and almost 70,000 students. But what about them? And if you look at the Indian diaspora, it's quite a strong in UK. How this Brexit, because I have colleagues in UK and we are in constant touch, number of their research project is related with the kind of a funding they are getting from European Union. So there are a lot of uncertainty on that, and Indian students, some of them who are going for their higher education in UK, also have this thing in mind. Like getting to UK is also like getting to European Union. They have a larger access. They can have more cooperation with number of these EU funding agencies. So how this complex situation of Indian diaspora or the people who are aspiring to be in UK for educational things, how that has to be dealt. because you are in India, you might be facing some of these questions. So what are the policies that are there, or you are thinking something on those lines? So that's my question for Alex and for Emmanuel, because you're a border studies scholar, and we always believe in a border studies that borders are not just physical; they are mental borders. And this entire debate in this Brexit, we also came to know, like, the immigration was one of the basic arguments, like, and if I go by I don't want to get into those debate, but just to highlight a few, like, people from Eastern Central European countries are taking up our jobs. They are ready to work on a less wages. And so we need to get back our jobs. That was one of the, and the kind of immediately after the Brexit, we have seen a kind of a racist things that happened. And even the UK Parliament have deplored those things. They said that these are not that we stand for. So, and with the historical position of UK, they have immigrants. It's a very cosmopolitan country. How that will unfold once they get out of European Union, because that is also is a kind of a mental border that's going to come up, because that, according to me, will have some impact on the cosmopolitan appeal, the character of UK. So how that is going to unfold in this, because that also has to be studied. It's just not about economy, it's just also about the psychological and the characteristics of the country, that is also going to have some sort of impact.
I might just touch on your second question and get into the first one, because, as I will explain, I might not be able to answer the first one. Your final point about the cosmopolitan appeal of the UK, and I think that's also something for Europe as well, actually. I think it's not just the UK which has been going through a period, in our case, which is around Brexit and so forth, but the same kind of debates have been happening all over the world, in fact, but also in parts of Europe with outcomes, I mean real outcomes, which are being seen in certain countries. I would say that although Brexit has been a very political, polarizing debate in the UK, there's no doubt about that. There is actually a political consensus across parties about Britain's internationalism. There are a few outliers, but amongst the mainstream parties, which make up the vast majority of seats in our parliaments and so forth, they have all talked about the response to Brexit not being turning inward, but looking outward. That's the same if you are on the sort of so-called Brexiteer wing, where you're happy with the WTO solution because actually you can do an ambitious trade deal with India as a result, or you have the people who, on so-called Remainer, want to actually effectively, or indeed really, stay within a customs union and not be able to do those kind of deals. But people are still looking outward and internationally engaged. And I think that is a very important thing that will be the basis of whatever post-EU exit foreign policy, how that looks. So I hope, and I do not think there should be any kind of lack of or a perception that UK and Europe aren't still fully engaged in the world. I think that's very important for many, many reasons. In terms of the specifics of the UK-India relationship and how that would be affected, I'd just say a couple of things. I think, first of all, I think, as you've heard, we are going through a very complicated process in terms of negotiating the deal with the European Union. We have to do that first. That is a key thing. Now, before we are starting to really look at our specific relationships on trade and other matters with other countries, a few countries have already, we are beginning to actually start more serious talks with. They are the ones you might imagine who have the closest alignment with our legal systems and so on and so forth. We are also, again, this is talks because we are not formally negotiating at this point, but we are able to talk to India through a joint committee that we have about some of these issues. So we are starting to think about it, but as I say, the focus has to be on the European Union in the first instance. On your point about research and students and so forth, I mean, I agree. I think this is really important. I mean, we are justifiably proud to have some of the top universities in the world, and we don't want to lose that. We are going to be working through a series of things that we will be part of the package of the deal, but also my own sense, and I'm not privy because it's not my department, but my own sense is that actually this will be a priority for a government to ensure there is a mechanism to retain that kind of talent and retain those kind of arrangements. There will be some disruption, as we've heard. There will be a mixture of disruption and opportunity, but I think that I sense, again, there is a political consensus around that as a priority. And for students, I mean, the wish, the hope to attract the brightest and the best from around the world is something that you hear people like me talking about a lot. You hear people from many countries talking about it a lot, and that's because it's true. And actually, I think India is second only to China in the number of foreign students, in number of Indian students who we get to lines, which frustrate my High Commissioner particularly. We actually issue a huge number of visas. I think it was 500,000, 500,000 visas to Indian nationals last year. Those figures have gone up. They've gone up in terms of the student numbers as well. So I don't think there's any lack of our willingness and indeed seeing the opportunity to have that kind of input into our society. I mean, I just round off by saying on all of these things, and this is slightly mischievous actually, but if you look at the interests of Indian nationals in the UK and the interests of Indian business in the UK, how would they be best served in the coming months? Actually, they are best served by the kind of smooth and good deal that we want to see with the European Union. That will be the least disruption for everybody, including Indian business, Indian students, and others.
Mental borders. So when Jean Monnet thought about the EU, he had a very economically driven approach, right? At first, he thought there are two ways we can go the cultural route, and there were movements that even, met in the 50s with this idea that you could create right away a political Europe. And he dropped the project, came back in the 90s, well, just before dying, a few years before dying, so late 80s, he came back with the idea that he should have gone the cultural route. And when you look at the work of historians like Tony Judd, a former Harvard Don who actually ended up working at New York University, he argued that if European states, member states, were not able to address nationalistic tendencies headfront, the EU project would fail. And we are maybe facing those now. The idea that regionalism should dominate political agendas, that ethnic, linguistic issues, sense of belonging to very specific territories should dominate. Then obviously we have issues. The EU has some programs, especially educational programs, that I think have touched a large number of students because, Erasmus basically brings together so many hundreds of thousands of students, but it has not really dealt with the people who are not going to university. And the difficulty, the mental map that you're talking about and the regional issues are very often carried by people who don't see the new economy as actually being part of their life. They feel bypassed, right? So I think the mental maps are still in the making, and I don't know if there are very effective policies to actually deal with those. I think that the EU could probably do a lot more, and the different countries struggle with this. I see this with my countries of birth, for instance, France. with pain every time I look back at what they are doing. My mom came from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is not doing very much better, where you have, nationalistic movements, again, even xenophobic movements there. So I think there are lots of EU officials are really aware of this. The EU has promoted policies of memorialization, and against the xenophobia, it has had parliamentary committees, and they've worked across, pan-European to change the images, right? To change these mental maps and to not really create a Europeanism yet, right? But to at least open the minds of people to that diversity. It's still, I can't say that it's bridge because, we study them and we're confronted with them right now. So it's not been very successful globally. But I think that those mental maps are one of the large issues this year, and this era. And as you were asking the question, I remembered I spent a term at the University of Durham a few years ago, 2010-11, and I was already Jean Monnet Chair at the time, and I was invited there to study borders. I was at the IBRU, the Institute for Border Research, and it was really quite interesting because most of my colleagues were skeptical about the EU, and a lot of them had EU funding at the same time. So you have this ambiguity, right? You have this sense of unease, right? And they know, the funding is quite significant, but the colleagues themselves had these mental map and were not too sure. The vice provost of the university, I had lunch next to him once, and he actually asked me to talk about, how do we do without the EU, and what do you think in terms of borders? What does this mean? What do we do? How does this work? So I think Tony Judd was right, and I think the EU is going through maybe a generation of questions. And you have some elected official, like Merkel recently, but also Emmanuel Macron in France, who have, in a way, confronted some of these issues publicly, and they have, in a way, said no to certain kinds of debates. This is not my Germany, I remember this. Or speaking to Madame Le Pen, the leader for the old so-called National Front in France. This is not your debate, madame. I thought that was, this is not your debate. Anyways, so very, very strong pushback, which also is a form of leadership towards new kinds of ideas. But certainly this is not dominating at least the media agendas right now in Europe. So. Yeah, the old mental maps are still there, and they're still quite strong. The old nationalism is still there.
There's one more last question here, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, my name is Aishwarya Srivastav. I'm a research intern at ORF. I have two quick questions. There is a sense that, through media reports, that Brexit has been a brash decision in many ways, with little reflection on many points of negotiation that have sprung up in the last 2 years. So I just want to know, what are your thoughts on this, and how much of this is true? And secondly, sir, you had spoken about sovereignty. My question is from that very point, that UK does not really fancy its sovereignty to be restricted in any way. And since the EU is a more utilitarian, unit, it tends to have more of an authority on the policies that UK as a country would have than any other international organization that UK is a part of. Has this been one of the premises that led to the decision of exiting out of the EU?
Brexit, a brash decision. It was a referendum, and it was debated. and people voted 2-point-something% above, right? So it's at least a full million of people voting. So if you compare this to other elections or other referendums across Europe, I don't know how brash it was. What I regret as a scholar, but you know, it's also because I teach public policy and I like to teach students to look at facts. And as I explained in the talk, facts narrow the debate. They are controversial. I'm a student of Karl Popper, you know, factual construction and how do you learn and all these things. So I do understand the issues quite well. In the case of the Brexit referendum debates, I think they were too polarized. And I think that, you know, when we hear things even elsewhere outside of the UK, but it's been in the media for a while, about fabricated news and fake news and so on and so forth, I think it's very dangerous. I think we need to stay as close as we can to the evidence that we have. Otherwise, we can discuss anything and everything flies. And we actually, it's a disservice to everybody. Whether you're a winner or loser, it's a disservice. So it makes me a little sad that the debate was so polarized and that some information was actually smartly moved, adjusted to very specific goals. There are reports that, you know, show that some of the debates were also influenced by other countries, other foreign services, for instance, that have a very clear agenda to undermine the construction of the European Union. Well, it's part of the democratic debate to actually know how to fight these things. And I think it didn't really take place. But that's, you know, that's kind of from an outsider and a very personal view. I would just tell my students, you need to look at the evidence. You need to collect data. You need to cross over the data, right? Elected officials do what they want. Now, on the issue of sovereignty, I'll speak very briefly. I'm like Tusk. I think that sovereignty today is way more complex than we think. And it's not about controlling your boundary lines. There are ways to influence countries, organizations today that states are working with, some just flirt with them. But you know, the information communication has come through and we're in a new age today. Controlling information or distorting information, changing the value of the information is really critical, whether you're dealing with numbers and computer systems, for instance, with just a 1-0, for instance, or interpretation, like in a court of law, right? So I think being a sovereign state is certainly, and controlling its boundary line, is certainly a 19th century idea. So in that sense, I'd be very critical of any elected official saying, you know what, my boundaries have to be hard. Why? Because hard boundaries, we know today it's almost uncontroversial. They prevent trade from taking place, and trade makes people wealthier and happier. So if you want, and I think the EU is a really good example of this, but it started, you know, actually with the unification of Italy. The very first studies that you have by economists that start showing, you know, that once you basically get tax boundaries, you pull them out of local states, the average wealth rises. So we have tremendous evidence that free trade creates value for people. And hard boundaries of any forms have a cost. And that's been also studied by economists. And we've known, probably since the 1940s, that the thickness of a border is not just the space. You know, it's not just, so a lot of economists, for instance, they have equaled the thickness of a border with the number of kilometers it takes you to actually reach it and cross it. And it has a cost. So I think wanting to be a sovereign nation that is very influential would rethink its borders and would want to basically work in partnerships with other sovereign nations and extend and work on the very difficult issues of aligning policies, for instance, because it expands your reach and it expands your influence. I find it really interesting that very small population, very small states in the EU are actually the ones who are the true winners. I mean, when I was your age, Ireland, joined in. Portugal joined in, a few years. It's amazing when you look at suddenly the transformation of the economy, right? So when you look at these small units, economic units, and you look at what they have become, and even in terms of trade, the reach that they have, right? Who has invested in these places over the years since then? They've become way more sovereign in a way. You can be sovereign in different ways. That's what I'm getting at, right? It's not just controlling your territory, but it's also influencing ideas. It's also being attractive. It's actually have influence on the world stage. You have very large, powerful nations today in the world, or fairly rich ones, that have no influence. Nobody wants to talk to them. They are sovereign. They don't exist. I mean, they're sovereign, but they're just sovereign on a piece of land. Nobody wants to invest. Nobody wants to discuss things with them. So I think I'm a little bit like Tusk, the current president. I'm biased that way. I think the understanding of sovereignty that the UK has is controversial in that case. I think the UK and the UK elite could think about a way of being influential through the EU that would make the EU different, but also would influence, increase its reach around the world. The thing is, it hasn't happened this way. At least a large part of the British elite on both sides of the political spectrum has doubted this. It's not just one party, it's many different organizations and supporting two different groups. So, please.
I think we're running out of time.
I wanted to give you the last words.
All right. Please, then.
You are very generous. I will have brief last words, but thank you. You made some really important points. And I would just conclude by where you began. This was a referendum. It was the democratic will of people. A substantial number of people voted for this. We are dealing with the implications of that, and that will be worked out. But fundamentally, it was because of that democratic process, and that's very important. You ask a very sort of poignantly political question, which, if it's the one that perhaps of all the questions, good as they were, this is the one that might get me sacked if I get my answer wrong. Was it a brash decision? No, for the reasons Emmanuel said, no, I don't think so. And also, actually, this is not a new debate in the UK. The UK has been uncertain of its relationship with Europe for some time. At the so-called Eurosceptic wing of those debates, decided not to join the euro, so on and so forth. So there are various things which are indicators over many years that we had a different sense of what our relationship as part of the European Union or now exiting the European Union would be. Final point, I leave on a sort of portentous bombshell in a sense, but I think what you were saying about evidence and fake news and information and the effects that is happening in many, many ways around the world. I would just say as a personal comment, I think that will be a bigger debate in 25 years' time than Brexit. I think that is a fascinating challenge for us all in the 21st century. So I just was interested that you brought that in and would sort of underline just what an amazingly important question that is for all of us. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much to Emmanuel and also to Alex for giving us this very insightful, differentiated, and actually also thoughtful morning. So.